By the end of that year, the comparisons stopped. Not because a fight happened. Not because a challenge was answered publicly. They stopped because those who watched closely realized something had already been decided. Speed had not confronted power directly. It had simply gone where power could not follow. What remains are accounts. Quiet, consistent, and difficult to dismiss. Told by people who were there, who noticed when the room changed, and understood why it never changed back. The year itself did not announce what it would become. It arrived without ceremony, carrying with it the same rhythms as the years before. Training halls opening before sunrise, arenas filling by habit, newspapers searching for the next comparison that would hold attention for a day and then dissolve. Muhammad Ali was already established, not simply as a champion, but as a presence that filled space. His fights were public events, his words replayed until they became part of the atmosphere. Strength, speed, endurance. These were discussed openly, measured loudly, argued without subtlety. His authority did not need defense. It was assumed. Bruce Lee, by contrast, was still being placed. He appeared between categories, never fully settled in one. To some, he was an actor who moved unusually well. To others, a martial artist who spoke in ways that felt unfamiliar, even unnecessary. His discipline did not present itself for easy consumption. It resisted quick summaries. It was in this uneven landscape that the comparisons began. Not formally, not with intent. They emerged the way careless questions often do, spoken by people who did not expect them to be taken seriously. Who would win? Whose speed mattered? Whether power could be neutralized by precision. The questions spread because they were simple. They required no understanding of context, no appreciation of distance or rules or intention. They flattened complexity into entertainment. And once spoken, they lingered. Lee did not respond publicly. There were no dismissals, no corrections, no attempts to redirect attention. He continued training as he had before, refining movements that appeared modest when viewed without patience. The lack of response unsettled some observers. Silence in this environment was often read as absence. But those closest to the training rooms noticed something else. Not urgency, not irritation, a narrowing of focus. Sessions shortened, movements stripped down. There was no visible preparation for a specific opponent, only an insistence on efficiency, on removing excess, on arriving faster than expectation allowed. Meanwhile, the noise grew louder outside. Articles speculated. Conversations repeated themselves. The comparisons became less about two individuals and more about symbols. Power versus speed, size versus control. The environment demanded a spectacle, even if none was offered. What made the year distinct was not the volume of these discussions, but their persistence. They did not fade. They returned, again and again, circling the same unanswered question. And with each repetition, the absence of a response began to feel deliberate. By the time observers began to notice the shift, it was already underway. The year had positioned both men without their consent, one as the unquestioned authority, the other as the unspoken variable. And in that imbalance, something precise was being prepared, not for confrontation, but for clarity. The room had not yet changed, but it was beginning to narrow. Authority rarely announces itself. It settles gradually, through repetition and visibility, until it no longer needs explanation. By that year, Muhammad Ali carried this kind of authority with ease. His presence was immediately legible. Even before he entered a room, expectations arrived ahead of him, formed by televised victories, measured statistics, and a public familiarity that bordered on ownership. Ali's power was not just physical. It was reinforced by context. The ring, the rules, the spectacle, these environments favored what could be seen and quantified. Speed had numbers. Strength had outcomes. Endurance had rounds. His dominance fit cleanly into these frameworks, and because it did, it was trusted. Bruce Lee existed outside that trust. His discipline did not align itself with a single arena. There were no standardized measures for what he practiced, no public ledger of wins and losses that could be cited without explanation. His authority, if it existed at all, was invisible unless one stood close enough to feel it. This difference mattered more than any technical comparison. Ali's authority was assumed by default. Lee's had to be discovered, and discovery requires attention, something the public rarely offers willingly. In casual conversations, this imbalance decided the outcome before the question was finished being asked. Those who dismissed Lee did not do so aggressively. There was no hostility in it. It was the quiet dismissal reserved for things that do not fit expected categories. He was smaller. He trained differently. He did not present himself as a challenger. In the economy of spectacle, these traits translated into irrelevance. Yet within private spaces, the contrast looked different. Lee's training did not emphasize accumulation. He did not add techniques for the sake of breadth. He removed them. Sessions were often shorter than expected, but more exacting. Movements were tested not for how they appeared, but for how little they required to succeed. Observers who had experience in multiple disciplines noticed the restraint. Nothing was wasted. There were no rehearsed flourishes. Even strength work was measured not to build mass but to ensure responsiveness under pressure. The discipline was quiet, almost clinical, and easily overlooked by those searching for display. Ali's authority shaped perception before any comparison could become serious. People spoke as if outcomes were predetermined, as if physical scale and public record settled the matter completely. The imbalance allowed the conversation to continue without ever becoming informed. Lee did not attempt to correct this. He did not seek validation through explanation. Authority, as he practiced it, was not something to be argued into existence. It either functioned when required, or it did not exist at all. This restraint created a peculiar tension. The more the imbalance was accepted publicly, the less pressure Lee appeared to feel privately. Those watching closely began to understand that the lack of challenge was not avoidance. It was selection. The year advanced under this quiet asymmetry. One man carried the visible weight of authority. The other carried none of it, and therefore had nothing to protect. By the middle of the year, the conversation no longer needed prompting. It surfaced on its own, in gyms, in interviews, in the margins of articles that were ostensibly about something else. Names were paired together as if by habit. Questions were asked without expectation of answers. There was no official challenge. No contract, no negotiations, no declared interest from either side. Yet the idea of confrontation persisted, sustained by repetition rather than substance. The public had supplied its own stage, even as no physical one existed. What circulated most freely were second-hand remarks. A trainer recalling something overheard. A journalist repeating a comment that had already been filtered through several voices. Each retelling smoothed out uncertainty until the story sounded intentional, even when it was not. Ali's name anchored these rumors with credibility. His authority gave weight to speculation. If a comparison involved him, it felt legitimate by association. Lee's name, attached repeatedly but without context, became the unresolved variable, the unknown that invited projection. Expectations hardened in the absence of evidence. People imagined how size would translate, how reach would decide distance, how power would assert itself eventually. These assumptions were rarely questioned because they followed familiar patterns. They required no new understanding. Lee remained publicly unchanged. He did not seek platforms to clarify his position. When asked indirectly, he answered narrowly, often redirecting toward training, toward principles that did not align cleanly with the question. To some, this felt evasive. To others, it suggested a lack of interest. Those inside his circle noticed the cost of this restraint. Silence does not end speculation. It intensifies it. Each unanswered rumor became an invitation for another. The tension accumulated without release, like pressure in a sealed space. What was absent was as instructive as what circulated. There were no attempts to stage exhibitions. No private meetings leaked deliberately. No effort to control the narrative. The lack of maneuvering suggested that the outcome, whatever it might be, was not dependent on public approval. Observers who understood competitive dynamics began to pay attention to the delay itself. In most challenges, time favors the loudest voice. Here, time favored no one visibly, and that unsettled expectations. The longer nothing happened, the more the conversation exposed its own assumptions. By late in the year, the tension had shifted in tone. It was no longer expectant. It was unresolved. People spoke less about what would happen and more about why it had not. The absence of action had begun to function as a statement. Without a stage, the public was left with only imagination. And imagination, when untested, tends to reveal more about the observer than the subject. It did not occur where people expected resolution to appear. There was no crowd assembled for it. No press alerted in advance. The setting was ordinary, functional, even forgettable. A training space used regularly, without ceremony, by people accustomed to seeing skill without spectacle. Those present were not there to witness history. They had come for routine reasons. Observation, training, conversation that stayed within professional boundaries. What happened registered slowly, because nothing about it announced significance. Lee did not frame the moment. There was no declaration, no explanation of intent. He did not invite comparison. The demonstration emerged naturally, almost incidentally, during a discussion that had drifted toward capability and limits. Someone asked a question, not a challenge but a technical curiosity. What followed was restrained. A sequence of movements executed without visible acceleration, without tension in the shoulders or excess preparation. The body stayed relaxed. Distance was managed with subtle adjustments, not steps. The action ended almost as soon as it began. Observers noticed the timing first. Not how fast it looked, but when it occurred. There was no delay between intention and execution that could be measured. The response seemed to arrive before anticipation had fully formed. Those watching felt the absence of warning more than the presence of speed. There was no attempt to overwhelm. No follow-through meant to impress. The movement stopped exactly where it needed to stop. Control, not completion, was the point. The space returned to stillness quickly, as if nothing had been altered. Only afterward did the recalibration begin. People replayed what they had seen, not in excitement, but in quiet reassessment. The assumptions they carried into the room no longer aligned cleanly with what had occurred inside it. What unsettled them most was not power neutralized, but irrelevance exposed. Strength had not been challenged or tested. It had simply not been required. The demonstration bypassed the framework most observers relied on to judge dominance. Lee offered no commentary. He did not explain what had been shown or why it mattered. When the conversation resumed, it did so at a different pace. Questions became more specific. Voices lowered. Those who had expected confrontation realized none had taken place. And yet, something definitive had occurred. The comparison that had fueled months of speculation no longer felt theoretical. It had been reduced quietly to mechanics. The moment did not spread immediately. It was carried by those who understood what they had witnessed and hesitated to describe it inaccurately. When it was shared, it was done carefully without embellishment. There was no spectacle to point to, only a small group of witnesses, and an understanding that certain assumptions no longer held. The shift did not announce itself through disbelief or denial. It appeared first as hesitation. Conversations that once flowed easily now paused in unexpected places. People chose words more carefully, or avoided certain comparisons altogether. Those who had witnessed the demonstration did not attempt to convince anyone. They spoke only when asked, and even then, their descriptions were limited. The event resisted exaggeration. Any attempt to dramatize it would have misrepresented its effect. What changed was not opinion, but certainty. The confidence that had framed earlier assumptions no longer felt stable. Dominance, once equated with size and power, now required qualification. Observers began to reconsider the structures they relied on to make judgments. This reassessment happened privately. There were no public retractions, no formal acknowledgments. People revised their internal models quietly, often without realizing they were doing so. The absence of confrontation made this possible. There was no outcome to defend or dismiss. Ali's authority remained intact in its proper context. No one suggested otherwise. His accomplishments were not diminished. But the idea that authority translated universally began to feel incomplete. The comparison itself started to appear simplistic. Li did not benefit publicly from this collapse of certainty. There were no headlines announcing a shift. If anything, his position became more ambiguous. Those who understood what they had seen found it difficult to explain without reducing it. Yet the effect spread. Not through claims, but through altered behavior. Trainers adjusted how they spoke about speed. Fighters asked different questions. Emphasis shifted from accumulation to timing, from force to access. What unsettled many was the realization that dominance could exist without display, that it could be present without requiring acknowledgement. The psychological impact of this understanding outlasted any excitement a direct confrontation might have produced. In private settings, the comparison lost urgency. People stopped asking who would win and began asking how certain movements worked at all. The narrative moved away from personalities and toward principles. This quiet collapse did not discredit anyone. It simply rearranged attention. What had once been obvious now required explanation. And what had been dismissed as peripheral began to feel central. By the time the shift was noticeable from the outside, it was already established within. The conversation had changed direction, and it did not return to where it began. Chapter 6. What remained years later time did what no confrontation ever could. Carried the moment forward without enlarging it. There were no anniversaries marked, no footage replayed, no official record to return to. What endured did so quietly, embedded in how certain people trained, taught, and spoke. Years later, the comparisons resurfaced occasionally. They appeared in interviews, in informal discussions, in the inevitable revisiting of legends. But they sounded different, less speculative, less insistent. The question of who would win no longer held urgency. It felt misplaced even to those asking it. Those who had been present that year remembered it with restraint. They did not frame it as an incident. They referred to it as a moment of clarification. Something that resolved itself without conflict, and therefore did not invite myth-making in the usual way. Li's influence grew, but not because of that year alone. It grew because his methods proved adaptable beyond their origin. Students carried them into other disciplines, other environments, often without mentioning where they came from. The principles traveled better than the story. Ali's legacy remained unchanged, but more clearly bounded. His authority continued to dominate where it belonged. What shifted was the assumption that dominance required expansion into every context. Respect did not diminish. It became more precise. What the year ultimately produced was not a winner, but a boundary. It separated spectacle from function, power from access, noise from effectiveness. That distinction proved durable. In later retellings, the absence of a fight became the point. People noted how little had been required to alter perception. How restraint, applied at the right moment, carried more weight than any prolonged display. Those who taught in subsequent decades found themselves referencing the lesson indirectly. They spoke about timing, about entering before resistance formed, about leaving no excess behind. They did not cite the year or the names. The teaching stood on its own. The incident became legend not because it was dramatic, but because it resisted drama. It offered no clear image to circulate, no decisive blow to celebrate. What it left behind was understanding, and understanding does not announce itself loudly. What remained was silence of a particular kind. Not absence, but completion. The kind that settles when nothing more needs to be proven. Years later, the year itself was rarely mentioned. When it was, it came up indirectly, through pauses in conversation, through the way certain instructors corrected a student's posture without explanation, through decisions made before force was ever considered necessary. The incident was no longer framed as a comparison. In fact, most who referenced it avoided framing it as anything at all. It had lost its competitive shape early. Without a contest, there was nothing to argue over, nothing to defend, nothing to mythologize in the usual way. What endured was instructional, not as a lesson delivered, but as a reference point quietly understood. When discussions turned toward effectiveness, someone would say, "There was a time when," and then stop short of finishing the sentence. The implication was enough. Lee's methods continued to spread, often detached from his name. Teachers adopted the emphasis on economy. Fighters spoke about arriving before resistance formed. Coaches reduced movements rather than adding to them. Few traced these shifts back to a single moment, but many were unknowingly shaped by it. The absence of spectacle proved essential to the lesson's survival. Because there was no public victory, the moment could not be reduced to ego or rivalry. It remained intact, protected from dilution by repetition. It could be returned to privately without distortion. Ali's legacy stood firm, but clearer in its boundaries. His dominance remained unquestioned within its rightful domain. What changed was the expectation that dominance must be universal. Respect became more exact. Comparisons grew more careful, then less frequent. Over time, the original question stopped being asked. Not because it was answered publicly, but because it no longer seemed relevant. The framework that produced it had shifted. Power and speed were no longer treated as opposing forces, but as variables governed by context. Those who trained seriously felt the change most clearly. They adjusted without announcing it. Drills became shorter. Emphasis moved toward timing and position. Efficiency replaced endurance as a measure of control. These changes did not require explanation. They worked. The incident settled into legend precisely because it resisted conclusion. There was no final image to circulate, no decisive moment to replay. What remained was a quiet understanding that certain assumptions, once abandoned, did not return. In the end, the year did not produce a story about winning. It produced a reference point for restraint, a reminder that mastery does not require confrontation, and that the most enduring lessons often arrive without asking permission to stay, and that, more than any comparison, is what lasted.